Yeah, I'll wait to share my screen.
Okay, here we go.
Got it. We'll have to see how many people show up to see if we should do an icebreaker.
With 22 at the moment, we might just want to jump into things.
Perhaps not. Are you going to be putting the link to the survey in the chat to Paul?
Yep, right after the presentation. So we've got 23 people here. Rachel, you can kick it off whenever you're ready.
Okay, hold on 1 second. I'm just like, this is what I used to do in grade school, y'all. Like, what in school at all? Like, I would do my homework like as the class is starting. Oh, I'm admitting. Are you admitting everybody?
Yep, I'm good. Don't worry about that. Nassisa and I'll handle that.
Okay, I'm trying to change my view here so I can see whatever shining faces are available to be seen out there. Hello, everyone. What an amazing turnout. I guess there's no fooling anybody as to why the heck everyone's shown up tonight. So glad to have you all here for a discussion around this very important project. So as you all probably know, Becca Hughes and Jonette Kunau are here from the city of Minneapolis to talk about the reconstruction, the design and reconstruction of the South Hennepin Avenue, which is a project that's been going on for a couple of years. So we've had a lot of discussions about it, and we want to continue to be a resource for the neighborhood. And so we're so glad, as always, to have Becca and her team here. I just want to give everyone just sort of a little what to expect out of the conversation tonight. When we have so many people show up, we want to have a little bit of structure to it, so we make sure that everybody gets the information that they're looking for and everybody has an opportunity to ask questions and provide feedback. So the way it's going to work today, Becca's going to give us a little presentation, about 15 minutes or so. And then we're going to open it up for conversation, question, dialogue around that. Since we have so many people and we want to make sure that everyone is provided time, we are going to have a couple of things that we're going to try tonight. One, the chat is basically we're going to be using the chat for questions. So when you put your question in the chat, it's just only going back to the hosts. So Paul and Nassisa and myself will see the questions come through, and that just helps us organize the questions so we make sure that everyone has an opportunity to communicate. So the chat will not be available for just banter between people in the meeting. That's not meant to shut anybody down. It's mostly just because we find that we get a lot of information streaming through that chat window, and it's hard for us to fish out the questions. So we're just asking for a little bit of grace around that. So that's one way to ask questions. And then the second way is, of course, old school, raise your hand and we'll just take it in the virtual real world. And so we would ask you to use the raise hand icon in the Zoom window, and that is under, I'm just going to make sure, under the reactions button at the bottom of the screen, there's just a raise hand button, and you can hit that. It shows up just like this, and then I'll be making a note of everyone who's raising their hands and in the order, and then asking people to contribute when it's your turn. And then this is something that I forget, is to unraise my hand. And I'm going to say that I'd like to give a bit of structure in terms of time frame. So if we could keep our questions and comments to about 2 minutes, and we'll see how well that works. And if it feels like everyone's getting some time, we might be flexible around that time, depending on how much real world communication is happening during this meeting. So that's a lot of business. We just ask that everyone be really respectful. We know there's a lot of passion, and this is just so important. And we want to make sure that we are being the best stewards to our community here. So that means that we all need to have a little bit of respect and civility, and just be inclusive to all the different and diverse opinions of our neighborhood that make it so special. So all of that said, did I miss anything, Paul?
You're good. Oh, one thing at the end, there is one thing. At the end, we will post both the city survey and a Google form for LHENA to be informed based on community input of how the organization will relay a letter to the city and the project team. So stick around for that.
And one more thing, a part of that is a survey that we've put together. So a third way of contributing your thoughts is through, third and fourth way is through a survey that LHENA's put together. We'll put the link to that in the chat so you can include comments there. All of that will also go into the public record. And then the fourth way is that the city of Minneapolis also has a survey and we'll include the link to that in the chat as well. Okay, business covered. Any questions? Becca, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So in addition to Jonette and I, we also have two other team members that I can see currently on the call. So just want to make sure that I'm acknowledging that Alan Klugman is also here from Traffic and Parking Services from Public Works. And then we also have Amy Barnsdorf. Her name is Amy Morgan on here, but she's also with Transportation Planning and Programming at the city in the Public Works Department. So as you noted, Rachel, we'll start with a presentation and we'll be happy to address questions when we conclude. So thanks again. All right, so just quickly for an overview tonight in terms of our agenda, we'll start with a brief project overview. We'll talk a bit about the recommended design and the technical support. So talking specifically about the recommended design option that is coming out of the Public Works Department. We'll conclude with project schedule and of course, questions. Hennepin Avenue. So it has been a bit since we've been visiting with you, LHENA. And so just to recap the actual limits of the reconstruction project itself, it extends about 1.3 miles on Hennepin Avenue from Douglas Avenue in the north to Lake Street on the south. There are many stakeholder groups that we've been engaging with throughout this 2-year process, in addition to the public open houses and other events. Specifically, there's 3 neighborhood groups, of course, East Isles, Lowry Hill East, Lowry Hill, 2 special service districts, as well as the Uptown Association, which is the business association for the corridor. We've received thousands and thousands of comments on this really challenging project, and it has been an interesting couple of years as we've gathered comments, and we've heard comments throughout the whole spectrum, but lots of comments on either end. And we can get into that a little bit later during Q&A if you're interested in more of those details. The policy plan. So, when we first kicked off this project a couple of years ago, specifically in 2020, and maybe I should take a step back and just remind the group too that, we first initiated engagement on this project beginning in 2018. And that was because we were looking to submit an application for federal funding to help offset some of the local reconstruction costs for this project. It was a successful application. We were awarded about $7.5 million for this project in federal funds. And so we started the project back in 2018, and we did start with some of this policy documents that you see here. Since, in the last few years, the City Council has adopted several new policies, and these are really the 7 that are the foundation for our work. So the foundation for our recommendations, the basis for our recommendations. So in addition to all of these different policy plans, right, which are the foundation, in addition, of course, we have technical analysis, and we do a lot of analysis of the different aspects of the corridor, traffic modeling, et cetera. And then we also look at public feedback and how do we incorporate into that, knowing that our foundation is the policy plans. So many of the key feedback themes that we heard throughout the engagement process specifically were unfortunately competing. So as I alluded to, we had sort of the full spectrum of comments, but we had comments on either end of the spectrum, and that was sort of the majority. And there were just so many competing comments that we received through all of the rounds of engagement. It just can't be addressed in one layout. And what we mean by that is that there's limited amount of space, right, that we're working with within an urban neighborhood, and limited space within the public right of way. So there's just a finite amount of space. And there were a lot of objectives that we were trying to achieve with this reconstruction effort. in addition to all of the policy guidance, which had this on all of the network maps. Specifically, some of the themes that we heard, however, were support for a bicycle facility on Hennepin Avenue. So that was something that we heard very loudly through our first 2 rounds of engagement. First beginning in 2020, we did hear concerns throughout that there was just not enough on-street parking that was being provided in either of the 2 options that we showed back in March. There was support for bus lanes and suggestions on how we could improve transit performance and priority along the corridor. We definitely heard concerns about traffic congestion and reduction of through lanes on the corridor, which we showed with both those options back in March. What does that mean for circulation and impacts to neighborhood streets? We definitely heard as well themes related to just greening overall as it related to this corridor. How could it be more pedestrian friendly? Can we incorporate spaces in which we can have sidewalk cafes and activity? And is there an ability to have sustainable stormwater features such as green infrastructure serving as an amenity along the corridor as well? We did also hear, especially in the beginning of the project, requests to delay the project, and we were able to push back reconstruction for about a year. Initially, when we brought this project out to you, we had thought that we would be starting construction in 2023. We were able to work with our federal funding partners to maintain that federal funding, but to push it back a year, which interestingly we've needed in order to get to this place that we are right now with a recommended design layout. This is a chart, and it's a simplified version of all of the different issues, right? So the street was last reconstructed in 1957. It's over 65 years old. It's antiquated, it's dangerous. There are a lot of concerns and issues that exist with the existing roadway. And what we were trying to do was address those, right, through this recommended layout. And this is basically a chart that summarizes what we believe are our efforts toward addressing them with the proposed layout. And we do feel that we were successful with many of these existing issues on Hennepin Avenue today, and being able to address those with a recommended layout.
So next we will talk a little bit more about the recommended design itself. So there is a snip from the recommended design on this slide, and we'll show you a couple other views as well. The full layout is posted on the project website if you want to look at specific blocks. So a couple of the key elements. One was consistent sidewalk space along the whole corridor. Today, there are some very narrow sections of sidewalk along the corridor. The recommended design does have a 2-way sidewalk level bikeway on the east side of Hennepin that's shown in gray on this graphic. And we'll talk more about why it's a 2-way bikeway. We are recommending 2 transit lanes, 2 full-time transit lanes. They're shown in red on this graphic. So 1 northbound, 1 southbound. Those are between Douglas Avenue and the Uptown Transit Station. 1 vehicle lane in each direction with left turn lanes at key locations. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. The layout does include additional vehicle lanes at the endpoint, so near Franklin and near Lagoon and Lake, where the traffic patterns and the traffic volumes are different than other parts of the corridor, and we needed to address some vehicle capacity issues there. Parking and loading was included on Hennepin where it was feasible and where through the analysis, we identified that it was most needed based on overall parking resources in those blocks. And then we also tried to preserve existing trees where that was feasible. So the previous slide showed a graphic kind of the overhead view, and this is showing the view sort of looking down the street. This would be looking north along Hennepin, showing some of the dimensions in a different way. So a couple things I will point out here. One is the median. We are recommending a median for much of Hennepin Avenue, and that is a key safety element in the corridor. The bikeway, as I mentioned, is proposed to be 2-way on the east side of Hennepin Avenue. That generally is a 10-foot bikeway, but at constrained points that is narrowed to 8 feet. In this section, you see the boulevard is shifted to separate the bikeway from the sidewalk, but the bikeway is sidewalk level, so it's behind the curb. This is a section at an intersection that has a left turn lane, so you can see the space for the left turn lane. Part of the bikeway design is actually to have a 6-foot buffer between the intersection and the bikeway. So the bikeway is moved back to be next to the sidewalk. And the purpose of that is to provide more space between the intersection and so that a turning vehicle is starting to turn when they see the bicycle, as opposed to being parallel. That's part of the one of the safety elements of the design. Then this section shows what it looks like where parking is fit in the corridor. This is one of the most constrained situations that we have along the corridor, where we are able to fit in parking. So you can see an example of what that looks like.
Great, and I'll dive into a little bit of the details. First, starting with pedestrian design. Just a quick recap, and I know you're all familiar with Hennepin Avenue in terms of existing conditions and context, but it is, and this is an important element, as Jonette has mentioned a couple of times, is that it is on the city's high injury network. So safety, again, was paramount when we were looking at how to redesign this corridor. And both pedestrians and bicycles are overrepresented in injury crashes. Also, as Jonette mentioned, right, we have inconsistent sidewalks in terms of width, and they're very narrow in some blocks, especially in the northern portion of the corridor. And according to our transportation action plan, which was adopted by the City Council in late 2020, it is on the pedestrian priority network. So in terms of an overall recommended design, one of the key features that we were trying to address with this also was the actual physical crossing distance itself on Hennepin Avenue. It is 60 feet curb to curb right now, with essentially 30 feet on either side of the center line. We were able to reduce that between 6 and 10 feet, depending upon where you are on the corridor. So the cross section is 50 to 54 feet. Again, depending upon where you are exactly located. Another thing that we really wanted to improve was on some of the long blocks along the corridor that are very long. We included enhanced, pedestrian crossings that will include signals. They will be signalized specifically at Fremont Avenue and 25th and Half Street. Curb extensions are included on cross streets. This is more difficult, of course, to accomplish on Hennepin Avenue, and we can't include them because of the fact that we do have curbside running transit lanes. But on the side streets, we are able to accomplish those in many of the locations where it is feasible. As Jonette mentioned, again, the median was intentional. It was to reduce conflicts at driveways and to minimize what's happening now on the corridor where there are left-hand turns. People are just looking for a gap in traffic and not looking for pedestrians or cyclists if they are operating on the sidewalk currently. So the medians will reduce those conflicts. And we were able to work with property owners as well along the corridor to close or consolidate 7 driveways. There were several large surface parking lots where there were multiple access points to Hennepin, and really that was an objective of ours from the get-go to try and reduce those situations. In terms of the typical, it's an 8-foot sidewalk from Lake to Franklin. Again, we have some constrained locations just based on all of the different competing interests and design standards that we have to meet. And then there will be 6-foot sidewalks north of Franklin Avenue. In terms of bicycle design, currently, as you're aware, there's no existing bicycle facility out on Hennepin Avenue. As mentioned, it is on the city's high injury network where the bicycles and peds are overrepresented in the injury crashes. Hennepin Avenue, with that newly adopted policy guidance in late 2020, does have Hennepin Avenue, the specific segment on the All Ages and Abilities Bicycle Network, so the AAA network. And at volumes like this, they do need to be protected facilities. In terms of the recommended design, as Jonette mentioned, it's a sidewalk level 2-way protected facility on the east side of Hennepin Avenue. It is typically 10 feet wide, but it does have that small 8-foot reduction where it is located at constrained locations. The design that we're looking to accommodate as well in the corridor does account for the existing and future protected bikeways on crossing the intersecting streets. So just as an example, 26th, 28th, where we've been able to accommodate that. I do think it's really important just to sort of remind you as well that, I know there's been some gaps in terms of timing with last rounds of engagement, but, we did evaluate and present different options for other streets as well as hybrid options for the corridor, but they just didn't meet our policy guidance. And so, there were also other trade-offs by moving the facility off Hennepin onto another facility. There were major impacts to parking in order to get that facility up to a AAA facility. We also did evaluate one-way bikeways, so having bikeways that were separated on each side of the street. And as you can imagine, we had a major challenge here is every foot, frankly, counted in every block segment as we look to make adjustments to accommodate landscaping, all of the other items that we were looking to fit into this constrained amount of right of way. So we did evaluate the one-way bikeways, just did not fit. In terms of transit design, you're probably all familiar with the fact that we did pilot bus lanes out on this corridor in 2018. We implemented dynamic lanes that are bi-directional in 2019, and we've been able to extract a lot of data because of the fact that Metro Transit tracks that via an AVL system on all of their buses. What we did find is that they have had a significant impact on transit travel times and transit performance with a reduction overall in 15 to 18% in the overall travel transit times, and also improving reliability from 50 to 75% as well. So we've seen good results with the facilities that we have currently out on the corridor. We do anticipate that with the integration and implementation of the E-Line BRT, which is a Met Council initiative, that will see ridership growing from 25 to 35%. That's consistent with growth that they've seen on existing lines, both the A-Line and the C-Line. And we do know that just based on the analysis that we have done, which we've done a lot of analysis relative to traffic and operations and destinations and origins, and we do know that the transit riders that are utilizing those facilities do have a destination on or near the corridor. It is also on the city's transit priority network as identified in the Transportation Action Plan. Of course, a recommended design, again, just recapping what Jeanette mentioned, full-time 24/7 transit lanes, curbside from Douglas Avenue to the Uptown Transit Station. There will be 3 BRT stops utilizing the Uptown Transit Station, and then 2 new stops specifically at Franklin and 25th. And that does result in an overall reduction in the amount of local stops, which is typical for how Metro Transit develops and implements their BRT facilities. And just one stat I wanted to share as well is that, Metro Transit has basically informed us that really through the end of 2020, BRT service retained 76% of pre-pandemic ridership levels. So we do know that despite drops in overall transit relative specifically to local LRT, that the BRT routes have still performed well even during the pandemic and with the overall ridership declines at Metro Transit. So just wanted to share that. And also just to acknowledge that we've been working really closely with Metro Transit on this. Currently E-Line is in development, but the intent is for construction to begin on those transit stops along this segment of the corridor, as well as other portions of the route beginning in 2024. So there will be overlap with this project so that we can minimize disruptions.
So just touching again on the vehicle design, starting with the existing conditions and context and really how that informed the design. So Hennepin Avenue today does have 2 through lanes in each direction. Those 2 lanes in each direction don't operate very well. There's a lot of lane changing, which we see really reflected in the safety and the crashes along the corridor. Often there are people that are changing lanes out of the right turn or out of the right through lane to go around a bus. And then there's left turners mid-block. And so people are changing lanes out of that left turn lane. So really congested and disrupted flow. In addition, most intersections or signals have restricted left turns during the peak periods. And a high number of the pedestrian and bicycle crashes involve left turn vehicles. So that was another thing that we were thinking about. As we talked about, Hennepin Avenue is on the city's high injury network, and it also is on the city's freight network. So the recommended design is really separating out those different uses. So transit is in its own lane. Left turns where they're allowed are in their own lane with 1 through lane. And the median is really intended then to improve safety so that those mid-block left turns aren't occurring. The left, where there are left turn lanes, left turns are allowed all day, so they won't be restricted like they are today. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there are additional traffic lanes near Franklin and between Lagoon and Lake Street based on the traffic needs in those areas of the corridor. This graphic shows the locations of the proposed left turn lanes. So 22nd Street, 24th Street, 26th Street, 28th Street, and then Lagoon and Lake Street on the south end. In terms of parking and loading, we have received a lot of comments about parking and loading. There are 311 existing on-street spaces on Hennepin Avenue. But we also looked at the overall parking resources in the corridor, and there are more than 3,600 parking spaces on Hennepin Avenue, on cross streets, in parking lots, and in parking ramps within one block of the corridor. So as we looked at the layout, as Becca mentioned, it is a constrained corridor, and there are 20 parking and loading spaces that we were able to fit into the corridor. And we certainly recognize that is not enough spaces to meet some of the needs and demands of businesses and residents along the corridor. And so the recommended design is includes district parking solutions, and that's represented in the yellow shading on this graphic. These are some of the blocks that we identified as focus areas for district parking solutions to better manage the overall on-street parking resource. And so what happens in those district parking areas could include meters. It could include short-term zones for loading, pickup, drop-off types of activities. And of course, it does include Hennepin as well as nearby block faces. And those were identified and targeted where the overall parking resources in those blocks were more limited. So maybe there weren't off-street parking lots, or the parking lots were very limited. And these two graphics just again speak to kind of how we looked at the overall parking resources and focusing the district parking strategies in the areas where the parking resources were the most limited. So touching on schedule, we are here in January of 2022. We're in the third round of engagement that's occurred since early 2020. And are sharing Public Works' recommended layout. We do anticipate that Public Works will bring that layout to the City Council in Q1, so February, March timeframe. The layout would need to go through City Council approval. Then there's still the final engineering phase, which would occur throughout 2022 and into 2023, with construction anticipated to start in 2024. So all of the project materials are posted on the project website, which is linked on this slide, minneapolismn.gov/projects/Hennepin South. The full layout for the corridor is there, as well as a summary of the layout, some frequently asked questions. There's a longer version of this presentation and a link to the comment form. The city is hosting a public open house tomorrow at 4:30 p.m., which will be a virtual meeting, and are asking for comments to be submitted through January 28th. So with that, we can open it up to questions.
Just real quick, one of the first questions that came through was about one of your graphics, Becca. So I might just ask you that one first. It was with, I'm sorry, I'm not going to remember like the slide number. It was like the last slide that you had presented with the checkbox for like, successes. That one. The question was, what do the yellow checks indicate?
Yellow checks mean that we weren't able to address them as fully as we would have liked. So we feel that the design that we've included, right? So if you look at the left-hand column in terms of issues with the existing roadway, if it's a green check, we feel that we have adequately addressed it with a proposed layout. Level of service for traffic, green space, which was one of the competing interests, right? With all of the other modal elements that we were looking to include within that space. We wish we could have more. We wish we could have had more space, been able to preserve more trees. And then parking, which currently isn't an issue, obviously is something that we're looking to address with district parking. So yellow means that we just didn't get to where we had hoped to get with it, but basically showing all of the areas in which we feel confident that this layout solves and addresses.
Thank you. Any questions off the bat? We did get some in the chat, but I want to provide a little moment here. Okay, well, I'll take a couple from the chat here. Peter Schmidt had submitted a couple. His first one here is stormwater question that he's heard from Chipotle employees, Lake Chipotle, and the stormwater runoff issues we have there. With this redesign, will there be opportunities to improve drainage and water management?
I can take that one. And I can't speak to what the design will be at that specific location, but what I can tell you is that the city did enact a new stormwater ordinance in 2021, and it calls for more aggressive treatment of stormwater and green infrastructure, so sustainable stormwater treatments. And so we are at the early phase of the stormwater design, but we are looking at both surface features and underground features to better handle stormwater. And then also looking at existing, like we have with other elements of the project, looking at existing issues that need drainage issues that need to be addressed with this project.
Thank you. I see Melody has her hand up, so I will ask you to ask your question.
Thank you. And I will lower my hand. Thank you. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the bicycling and pedestrian paths and what experiences you've had in other places with the city with pedestrians and bicyclists kind of commingling. I'm a bicyclist and a pedestrian. And when I first look at it, I think, oh my gosh, there's going to be pedestrians walking in the bike lane all the time. But you all have done this before. I mean, you're the experts. So what is the experience with these paths and other places in the city?
I was going to say there might be some pauses on our end as we look around to trying to decide who's going to address it. Jonette, I don't know if you would address it just based on the work that happened recently on downtown Hennepin. Obviously that street is just reopening, and there's work there that is similar to the facility is different, but there's some similar design treatments that have been integrated.
Yeah, so a couple of the strategies are, one, we talked about wherever we can, we try to have physical separation of the sidewalk and the bicycle facility to try to limit conflicts between those two spaces. Where that isn't possible, you will see there's a buffer that's identified. So typically there's at least a 1 foot buffer. So what happens in that 1 foot buffer is also something that the city is looking at and testing and looking at what other cities are doing as well. If you've been downtown, you might have noticed on 4th Street and on Hennepin Avenue in downtown, there are some linear tactile strips, which is intended to be a delineator between what is the sidewalk space and the bicycling space. We also use different pavement colors. There have been a number of different treatments. They're not all 100% effective because people go where they want to go, but are really trying to manage those conflicts. And then I would say specifically at BRT stations, you'll see some of this in downtown, and though there's some of the elements are still being installed, but there are some railings at the bus stops, as well as some sort of designated crossing areas to cross between the BRT platform and the sidewalk, attempting you know, to delineate where should people on bicycles expect to see people crossing the bikeway, and where should pedestrians, you know, where should they cross? And it's not right at the end of the shelter, it's a little bit away so that the sight lines are clear.
I'm going to follow that up with a question that came in from Katie, because it's similar. Becca, you had mentioned that volumes meant that the bike infrastructure needed to be protected. Which volumes, bike or car, drove the need for protection?
When we were first looking at this was even before adoption of the Transportation Action Plan, we knew with the vehicular volumes that this certainly couldn't be a situation in which it was just a typical painted facility, as you see all across the city. And then it was further reinforced when the Transportation Action Plan was adopted and standards were laid out for how the AAA network would be deployed. And really that is about, especially in urban environments, on some of these major corridors where we do have them on the AAA network, they will be protected type facilities. So, you know, if that may be bollards in some circumstances where it's not affiliated with a reconstruction, we typically look at bollard improvements as being a temporary sort of treatment as we move closer and more frequently towards integration of curb protected in situations where we aren't reconstructing a street. But in the most recent examples, and two of which that Jonette highlighted, when we have reconstructions of streets, we're looking to move those off the street onto a facility similar to what we're putting on the Hennepin Avenue corridor.
Thank you. Mary, you want to ask your question? Oop, I think you're still muted, Mary.
There, sorry.
No worries.
Okay. I'm curious. I listened to the provisional parking that you were talking about, and I had the opportunity for a number of reasons to talk with a lot of the businesses up and down Hennepin Avenue, and they're really afraid of their viability and their ability to maintain their business model because it relies not just on foot traffic, but heavily relies on people coming in from outside the neighborhood to keep their business going. And a lot of them don't have access to parking lots, and I'm surprised some of them aren't here tonight. I'm sure they'll be there tomorrow, and have been present at other meetings, but just wanted to be able to, because we are so interdependent, and many of the business owners are also residents of the neighborhood. Just curious as to how their needs are going to be accommodated within all of this. You talked about, I forget the phrase that you used, some sort of provisional parking or ability to be able to manage that. I know that the Uptown Association has had concerns about it, and when we had the two meetings, the options were really eliminating the parking and not, I mean, there were two options of eliminating a lot of the parking. It goes from around close to 400 parking spots to, did you say about 30? Is that right? It goes down by about 90%. Is that correct?
The number of spaces is 311 to approximately 20. Yes.
Yeah. So about 90% or more reduction in parking. So.
And hey, Mary, maybe I'll start again. Alan Kluckman, I'm with the Traffic and Parking Services Division, and then we might all kind of tag team this. But, a question that's come up a lot, and I think the word you're looking for is district parking. That's kind of the theme that we're working with. And it's kind of a multifaceted approach. And we know that we in the community and the businesses have some work to do into the future. So we're not denying that. We know there's work ahead of us. And step one is we want to manage and control the resource that we manage and control, which of course is our public right of way. And I'm just a bit more about district parking. We kind of gave a brief overview in the presentation, but when we think of the side streets and the intersecting north-south streets that touch Hennepin, there's actually a fair amount of curb there. And presently that's, it's not actively managed. And we think there's a strong resource there that's in close proximity to the Hennepin storefronts, that if we better manage that through things like meters, loading zones, signing, marking, short-term uses, et cetera, we can start to capitalize on that as a resource that's available. So step one, or part one, is the city commits to managing the resource that we have. And I just want to speak a little bit more about that to give some standing to that. A few times tonight, we've referenced the Transportation Action Plan, which was adopted last year. In among the strong policy guidance and very prescriptive techniques and policies that are in there, there's a couple things that are more actions yet to be done. And one of those is development of a citywide, I stress that, citywide curbside management policy. So in the next couple of years, that's something we'll be working on as a city throughout the city. And Hennepin is actually maybe step one of that, is applying that to the Hennepin corridor. So it's just kind of my way of saying is, we know there's work to come yet on how the city manages our own resource. And frankly, it's a little bit changing our mindset in terms of how we look at that curb, who we kind of assign it to or allow it to be used by. So that's the part that we can do. Maybe two more points I want to make. The second part is we feel the business community needs to work with us and frankly be creative and be open-minded. And there's probably going to be some changes in how they do business, and we hope they're open-minded to that. I think to some extent, the curb space along Hennepin is used because it's available and convenient. But as Jeanette pointed out with statistics on that one slide, the parking along Hennepin is really only a fairly small percentage of the overall corridor parking. So we do think there's an overall resource there. It just needs to be thought of a little bit more and used a little bit more robustly than it is right now. And then finally, I think the third thing I want to say is that we just want to stress that this is still somewhat early in the process. We're developing our layout, we're developing our design. The next step is to work with the city council to get approval. But we know that between now and 2024, when we begin construction, it's a 2-year construction period, we commit to working with the community on how can we work with the businesses, working with the residents, how can we best manage our overall resources to provide the parking that's needed for those businesses. But we want to be honest about it. We know that the businesses probably have to change their mindset a bit too, kind of work with us on it. So we know we have some work ahead of us, but we commit to being here to do that work.
Alan, if I could maybe just add one more thing. So one thing that is different about this district parking strategy. So the way that parking and loading zones are established now is that an individual business requests from the city what their specific business needs. And so they're able to, for example, establish a short-term zone in front of their storefront. And it really is handled on a business by business, property by property basis. That's the way it's been done for a long time. So what this is saying is really a different way for the city to do business in that regard, which is to take a more holistic approach, because what you do in front of one business affects every other one. And so trying to take a holistic approach to identify, again, like Alan said, what is the best way to manage those resources for the overall district?
Just a follow up. I'm glad to hear that you're still working with the community and still working with the businesses, because a lot of us have strong relationships with them. There's a lot of BIPOC businesses that have opened up along the corridor, and they put everything that they have into them. And we want to see them thrive. We want to see them continue. And this, I'm glad to hear that you're working with them, and that they need to be open to being creative, but that the city needs to be open to hearing their concerns and, working on this. And it's all a compromise within all of this. So.
Thank you, Mary. Chelsea, I see you have your hand up. I have about a million questions have come into the chat. So I'm going to do one of those questions and then get back to you, Chelsea. Okay.
Okay.
From David Cook, what conditions were there on the federal funding that the city received? In what ways could changes or delays to the project jeopardize the federal funding?
That's a great question. I think anytime that you have outside funding sources, there are different stipulations. There was no specific stipulation in terms of how we designed the street. The foundation, again, for what we selected, right, as a design option is what's outlined in our policies, those 7 guiding documents. So there's no stipulations in that regard. However, there are different benchmarks that we have to meet in terms of having a design and getting through the design portion. And typically, and this is going to seem like a random number, but typically when we get to around layout approval, when we're bringing a layout approval forward to city council, it's at about a 30% design stage. So we need to get obviously to 100% and get our plans into the process. And so there's paperwork and things that we need to do. We've been compressing our schedule throughout this process so that we could have more time for engagement, so that we could be responsive to what was happening in the community. And we know that, it's been challenging on the Hennepin Avenue corridor as well as throughout the city. And so we were, delaying some of the engagement that we had throughout this process. So we've kind of scrunched our timeline a lot here towards the end. At this point, we do need to move forward. And that means that, we don't have a lot of time to continue to integrate delays into the schedule. We're, again, hoping to bring this forward, to the city council and get approval, again, at the end of the first quarter, probably at the very latest, second quarter, early second quarter of this year. If we're not able to accomplish that, it does jeopardize our funding, and there's a whole bunch of different sort of consequences that happen as a result of that, changing program years, et cetera. One thing we do know is that, there are some existing infrastructure and utilities on the southerly portion of the corridor that do need to be replaced and repaired. So it's not just, a roadway condition element, although I think we could probably all agree that, the existing context of the corridor, the sidewalks, everything really does need to be replaced. They are not in good condition, nor is the road surface. But we also have underground utilities that do require and need to be upgraded as well. So there's a lot of different things that we're balancing here, but there's no question the street does need to be reconstructed. And our hope is that we don't have to delay this project, another couple of years, and then hope that we get federal funding reallocated for the project.
Becca, maybe I could add one thing to what you said about the federal funding, and just for the group, because this is kind of a detail, but I'm kind of a detailed sort of guy. As Becca said, when we submitted the application, and the way the process works is we don't really specifically spell out the exact design of the road. That's what we're working through now. But with this concept, we have reviewed that. And in fact, for the federal money in Minnesota, I think this is typical in all states. The agents who oversee and kind of manage that money are actually the state DOT, in our case, Minnesota Department of Transportation. And we have reviewed this layout recommendation with the MnDOT representatives who manage the federal money, and they have approved this layout. So I just want to point that out, that at the date of application, we didn't have a roadway design spelled out. We've now reviewed this with MnDOT, the number of lanes, the bus lanes, all the various conditions and elements of the layout, and they have approved that. So I just want to point that out, kind of a housekeeping detail, but that step has been taken care of already. And again, just want to mention that, so in addition to the schedule, discussion that Becca said, just let you folks know that we've been closely coordinating with MnDOT as the federal agent, and they've accepted this layout.
Thank you. Okay, Chelsea, over to you.
Thanks so much. So thank you for this presentation. I learned a ton. One question I had, it's similar to Mary's, because I'm hearing just the gravity of the concern around parking, and also just noticing the amount of valuable real estate that's being allocated to bikes in a city where, it's cold a lot of the year and many fewer people are biking in the winter. Have we considered a situation or sort of a compromise that allows for more flexibility for those bike lanes to transition into parking spaces during the winter? During the last election season for the city council, I also heard some candidates mention the possibility of electric vehicle charging stations that bring some value and some attraction to the corridor. And I'm curious, have we thought about either of those options, other ways that we might be green and other ways that we might respond to the realities of us living in a very cold climate where most people are not biking for most of the year?
Great questions. I'm actually going to kick it over to Alan, because we almost answered a very identical question, two-part question similar to this the other night by a different constituent. So great question.
Yeah, no, Chelsea, you had a lot there. I actually took notes, and if I don't catch it, please let me know. So maybe a couple questions. One is the bike lane flexibility, and other is EVs, and I'll maybe start with those. Just quickly, I think on the bike lanes, and we've spoken a bit today, but maybe we'll reiterate it. This is a strongly policy-based design. And when our policies direct us towards bike lanes and enhanced bike facilities, and I'll just tell you this, in fact, maybe I might even show an exhibit, hang on. We greatly mean bikes to be a year-round activity. If you can see my screen, I rode my bike to work today. So I ride in on a bike trail that's plowed and maintained. And but I want to be serious about that. When we commit to bike facility, we truly mean it as a 12-month facility. So I want to be honest with you, I don't see a flexibility issue where in the winter, a bike facility, even before we get into design and where it's located on the sidewalk level and so forth, I just need to be honest with you, I don't see a scenario where we would flexibly remove a bike facility and make a parking facility for someone. So I just want to be honest with you. The second comment relates to EV, electrical vehicles, charging stations and things like that. And you're spot on, the city greatly supports it. You know, we want to see electrification of vehicles, and the city is doing steps to help enhance that and support that. And specifically, we are installing electric vehicle charging stations at a number of spots in the city. We started in the fall of 2021. They're not turned on yet. We expect them to be turned on in spring of 22. We actually, long story short, we partnered with the city of St. Paul, and we're doing a number of stations across the two cities. But I just want to tell you, they will coexist, and let me just describe it as otherwise parking areas. I don't think, for example, that we would add an additional parking to a road like Hennepin just to support EV. We will kind of capitalize and opportunistically look where we have parking. In this case, maybe it's on side streets, but just generally speaking, where we have parking resources, we're committed to making some of those EV available. And that's how we would achieve kind of EV distribution throughout the city.
Thank you so much. I'm going to put another question in the chat to give other people possibility to speak, but thank you for that answer.
Thank you, Chelsea. I appreciate that. And Carrie, I know you have your hand up, but I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to bounce the chat and come back. So Ethan, Sharon, their question was, can you identify any examples either locally or nationally of situations where improved bike and pedestrian infrastructure resulted in a decrease in business viability along corridors where on-street parking spaces are reduced? I guess you could interpret it that either way.
Okay, so that's tricky. I'm getting my mind wrapped around this. We actually participated, and I'm not going to have all of the details, but the city actually participated in a study, and it was available when we had the old website. I think it is being uploaded to the website now, but it's a study that was conducted by Bennett Midland. It's a consulting firm where they evaluated some of the impacts of integrating bike facilities, specifically on corridors. There were some that were identified in Minneapolis, but there were other corridors as well that were established. And what that study essentially concluded was that there were benefits to having bike facilities on commercial corridors. And it's interesting because, you know, we knew that these types of questions were going to come up too. And when we first started this project in terms of bike facilities impact on economic vitality, were there decreases, increases? And I think what's interesting about it is that there's a lot of different types of research out there, but I think sometimes the interesting part about research is who's funding it as well. And sometimes it's directed by, business associations. Sometimes it's directed by public agencies. But I would say that it's my assessment of it anyway, and I don't know if Jonah and Alan have different thoughts on this, but I would say that it's still somewhat in infancy. There are studies that are out there, but I think you have to be sort of careful in terms of the interpretation. In the circumstance of the Bennett Midland, that was information that they worked with the city for a number of years on, as well as several other cities, in collecting economic data and working with some of the specialists that exist in CPED at the city of Minneapolis. And so the findings in some circumstances, they found it was a net, no gain, no loss. And so it was inconclusive in terms of the impacts, but there were several circumstances that were identified where they did find it to be a benefit, and that there were actually increases in economic activity as a result of the integration of bike lanes.
Well, and Becca, maybe I'll piggyback just slightly on your comments there into the question, and I'm going to take a step back and expand the question. We're talking about business relations, business viability. And I think if we expand the time frame, and I love that Becca pointed out that the road's 65 years old, because it's only slightly older than I am. So we're building a road today that needs to last many, many, many decades. And we really want to build a road for the future. And I think part of that future is having a sustainable, reliable future. And a big part of that is that people can travel by all different modes, right? And we talk a lot about that, and it's really important. So there will be opportunities in the future as those other modes exist for people to use this corridor. And in addition to things like sustainable and reliable, and obviously with our climate footprint goals, for folks who don't own cars and travel by transit, travel by bike or foot. I mean, this road speaks to a lot of audiences and a lot of stakeholders. And I think sometimes we don't remember to state that, right? that we're building a road for the next 50, 60, 70 years, and who will be using it. So some of those facilities that we're putting out there today, all of the facilities that we're putting out there today, we think they give us a strong foundation into the future. And I think that's a big part of the story that sometimes we forget to tell.
Thank you. Carrie, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Rachel. Carrie Johnson. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a Wedge resident, former LHENA board member. And I think this kind of ties on to the last question, but I really do think we are seeing more case studies for stronger economic vitality once corridors have been redone to better support slower and safer and healthier streets. More people are likely to be out on the streets. I certainly know I will be if I can walk. I'm most likely going to be a more frequent pedestrian on Hennepin if Hennepin is redone. I am not a year-round biker. I have not gotten to that phase yet, but maybe if there is the infrastructure. But my question is really around if businesses are feeling kind of this strain, because I know COVID has put this strain on them as well. They've had to be really adaptable. And I think that there is an opportunity here. Have they been connected to organizations that offer BTAP, the Business Technical Assistance Program, to work with business advisors to help adapt their businesses, help to make adjustments, think and plan for the future. I work at an organization that offers BTAP, so that's kind of why it's on my radar. But how can we better support businesses, I guess, in making them feel more comfortable with these changes and basically show up for them and turn out for them to say, hey, you know, we can do both at the same time.
All right, I'll jump in and address this. Jonette, Alan, feel free to add anything more. Thanks, great question. What I would say is that at this point, you know, we've really been working through, again, sort of like this policy basis foundation. Then we've done this technical analysis, and of course, we're hearing all this feedback. And yes, we are hearing a lot of pushback from the businesses that are uncomfortable about potential changes and impacts to their business. And what I can say is it's similar to the commitment that Alan made earlier about just our dedication over the course of the next couple of years and what needs to happen. You know, we won't be removing, you know, any of the infrastructure until 2024. We have 2 years to really begin these processes of having specific, you know, one-on-one conversations with businesses, whether it's about parking or other resources. So those details are yet to come. You know, we've certainly been engaging with businesses, but about specific outreach programs that we may need to point people to as reconstruction begins. We're just not at that level yet. You know, we need to get through a layout approval process, and given how controversial it is, you know, we'll see sort of what the outcome of that is. As you all know, we're also in addition to having you know, new incoming council members, we've got a different government structure that is sort of shaping up before our eyes. And so there's some uncertainty too in terms of process and outcome and what's going to happen here. But our intent is that should this layout be approved by the council, the mayor, we are committed to making sure and ensuring that businesses feel like they are being catered to by the city of Minneapolis staff, whether it's about parking or resources or different types of elements. And so I know that as a project team, we're really committed to that. And, you know, it's, you know, some of the comments that we receive about how much we, you know, hate Minneapolis and why are you taking away all the parking? It couldn't be any further from the truth. You know, all of those comments hit us pretty hard because we're all personally invested in Minneapolis, and we want to make good choices for the future, which means that we need to bring people along. And we know how hard change is, but we want to help facilitate that transition to make it easier.
Thank you. I just want to say I appreciate you all being here. I appreciate all the hard work that you're putting into this. And I really am supportive of this design. I'm just trying to figure out how we can bring everybody along. So thank you.
Carrie, I have to jump in. I have very little to add to what Becca said about the business connections, but I just want to point out to you, call me sometime. We'll talk about winter biking. Here's my 3 suggestions. You got to keep your hands warm. You got to keep your feet warm. And when it gets really cold, you get one of those face masks and you're good. So we'll talk later, but that's what I learned when I started biking year round.
Oh my gosh, Alan, you crack me up. Okay, so tons of questions still coming in. This one from Sam Penders. I'm worried that the bus lanes will be blocked by cars. How will we keep cars out of the bus lanes? For example, a small curb between the bus and the travel lanes, or onboard traffic enforcement cameras like New York City uses. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, let me start. Now we'll get serious. And Jonette, please jump in. A couple really good comments there. And I just want to talk a minute about what Jonette said. And I just want to stress this, Jonette said it, so I don't want to repeat the whole thing, but we really are developing a system here, right, where each mode has its own real estate. And partly why we feel really good about this design, and I'll kind of call it a 2/3 design for the cars. We'll go from 4 lanes today to 2 plus turn lanes. Is that with the median that Jonette talked about, which keeps us from the left turns and the backup and confusion that that causes, and with having the buses in their own space so that they're not interfering, kind of weaving in, merging in and out with the cars, stopping at stations with kind of their rear end sticking into the lane, that really kind of clarifies the travel modes and the travel paths. And I guess where I'm going with this is we feel we're going to have pretty good traffic flow on Hennepin north-south and less of a need for people to sort of cheat and go into the bus lane. So step one in my comments is we think we have a well-designed roadway which sort of separates modes and gives them each their own real estate. So, we don't feel there's a need for cars to cheat into those other lanes, and they don't need to go around a left turner because the only place you make a left turn will have a lane. So that's kind of part one to that. Part two is, will some people cheat? Probably. I mean, that's human nature. And we've talked to our traffic control people about, and Metro Transit Police, about the need for future enforcement and ongoing enforcement of this into the future. So again, kind of like some of the other things we've talked about, that's something we'll be working on a little bit more in the future. With step one is get a layout approved, get it designed and built. And as we move into that time frame, we'll be thinking about some of the operational details. Very specifically, what you talked about with how we could do enforcement if we need to, are the buses available to do so? And they are in some states and some other cities. As of right now, we do not have that ability. You might remember, 15 years ago or so, 20 years ago, the city tried some red light running camera enforcement techniques. We were basically denied at the legislature with that. So long story short, right now in Minnesota law, we don't have the ability to do that kind of automatic enforcement. I don't know that's something we're going to be pushing for right now immediately. I would love to have the buses have that availability. I think they have it. I know they have it in New York City and some other places. But I just don't want to mislead you and suggest to you that that's a tool that we'll have in our toolkit the next few years. I just don't think we will. But like I said, we've talked with primarily Metro Transit Police in terms of this will be a new facility that has major benefit. And as part of our overall operational plan for it, we need to have an enforcement element as well.
I was just going to add, we did look at curb separating the bus lanes. So we looked at center transit lanes, curb separated. We looked at outside curb lanes with a curb. And the conclusion we really came to is all of those options required more space. And that space was at the sacrifice of space for the bikeway or trees or sidewalk space. And we didn't feel that that was that trade-off was worthwhile. And so to have that high quality bike space and high quality pedestrian space, that did mean that the transit lanes are not curb separated.
I'm just going to add one thing and just say that that was my dream. I didn't give up for a really long time just because we understand the critical nature of trying to separate different modes and separating them out within the public right of way, and for efficiency, safety, all of those reasons. And I probably drug that on for months longer than anyone on my team wanted me to. But the whole idea when we first entered this equation was how we provide some physical separation between these uses. And it just, as Jonette mentioned, it came down to an exercise and just space trade-offs. And it wasn't something that we were able to accomplish, unfortunately, with this layout.
I'm going to use this window to just give my own little opinion on a thing. I will tell you that it's the separation of modes has been my biggest concern about this design, because that little bit of conflict helps slow people down, right? Like my concern with the separation is that now we're going to have a car, a bus, and a bike superhighway. and sometimes when they interrupt each other, it might throw the bus schedule off, but will also just slow everybody down because it makes people pay more attention. So I'm personally like okay with that a little bit, but that's fine.
Rachel, just a super quick comment about that, because that's a fair comment about the buses, and Will is kind of, and I know you kind of made it somewhat tongue in cheek, like a bus highway. We work really closely with Metro Transit. It's probably one of our best partnerships is the City of Minneapolis Public Works and Metro Transit. And we talk with their operators or their supervisors of the operators and like rules of operation. And I think their phrase is standard operating procedure. And long story short, we've done a lot of pretty nifty things with buses, reverse flow buses and special lanes and U of M Transitway where buses and LRT coexist. And we've always worked with Metro Transit on what's the safest and best way to operate those. And they train their drivers. They put a lot of effort into training, things like training videos and sessions. We've attended those. So I think it's a good point you brought up that I just want to emphasize that when we have these bus lanes, the drivers who use those routes will be well trained on what that urban environment is, what to look out for, speeds to travel and so forth. So that is something that's kind of on our radar. Just want to point that out.
Thank you. Sorry for pointing it towards me. So a question from Regina. Are there any design elements in addition to some curb cuts at intersections to make sure drivers making right turns can see people walking and biking across the street?
Yeah, I can start on that one. So in terms of the intersection design and how conflicts between turning vehicles and people walking and biking are managed, couple elements there that are really aimed at safety. One is at all the intersections, the curb radii are tightened up so that it is more of a 90-degree turn. You know, this corridor is challenging because it's on a skew. But one of the things we're really trying to do is tighten up those intersections so that the turning speed has to be lower is one. At the locations that are not signalized, we are planning to implement raised crossings everywhere that's feasible. So if you think about some of those cross streets that intersect Hennepin that are not at a signal, the bicycle and pedestrian crossing would be raised. So again, another speed control piece. And then on many of the cross streets and almost all of the cross streets, there are curb extensions. So again, just trying to tighten up the intersection to cause those interactions between people walking, biking, and driving to be at lower speeds.
Janet, maybe I missed it. Did you specifically just now refer the bend out bike design also? I'm not sure if you said that and how that's a somewhat newer element than say what we had on Washington Avenue from about 6-7 years. Maybe just a moment on that.
Sure. I'm actually going to bring up a drawing so it's a little easier to understand what we're talking about. So there is a bend out bikeway design, which the purpose of that is to, again, provide buffer space between the turning vehicle and where the bikeway is. So what we're really talking about there is an example is here. So the bikeway is at the curb. And there is a buffer there, but as we get to the intersection, the bikeway is pulled back. And the reason for that is so that there can be that full 6-inch curb all the way up to the intersection. As Alan mentioned on Washington Avenue, what happens is the curb drops as you approach the intersection, which can make the right turn space actually much wider, and those turns can be at a faster speed. So this is keeping that curb all the way up to the intersection. And then as the vehicle is turning, there's a little bit more space until they first encounter that bicycle so that they're at a better angle to see that bicycle as opposed to being parallel. They're already starting to turn, and so the visibility is better.
And I'll just repeat, I think Melody had one of the first questions, talked about some of the bike ped separation and so forth. And again, I just want to stress, this is an example. I think Jeanette spoke to that answer in terms of, we've kept up with the industry. We've put a lot of design effort to these. And if you look at the roads we're building now, like Hennepin downtown, First Street downtown, as opposed to something from even like 6-7 years ago, we really progressed in our thinking or advanced in our thinking of what makes for safe design. So again, I'm kind of somewhat belaboring this point here, but I think it's a really important one. It just kind of shows some of the level of detail and care that's gone into this design for all these features and elements.
And maybe one more thing, if I could chime in too, just because you have this up currently, Jonette, on your display, you can see sort of as if you're going north or south on Hennepin at the specific intersection, you can see where the median itself terminates. And as I mentioned earlier, we're at about a 30% design level. And so there's much more design work to come, but where you can see the termination of the medians, specifically on this to the left of your screen, if it's mirrored, it'd be to your right. But in that specific location, we'd be looking at doing something similar to what was integrated potentially on Grand Avenue, where we do have some of those hardened center lines as well to sort of extend up to the intersection. So that will also help with people and prevent people from trying to cut the corner to take that at high speed. So that's something that we'll work through as we move forward with final design should this layout be approved. But just wanted to add that element in as well, just for an explanation.
And this would be an example of where the sidewalk and the bikeway would be raised at a unsignalized intersection.
Okay, we've had a couple of questions come in about the decision to sort of stop the project at Lake Street. There's been a couple questions about continuing the transit lanes all the way down to Lake, like past Lagoon, and because of congestion issues, and also the bike lanes. Can you talk a little bit about like the decision to sort of stop those modes of transit at Lagoon? Or previous, or where you decided to stop it? I'm paraphrasing a couple of questions here, so.
Well, Alan, did you want to take the question specifically about the transit lanes, or Jonette relative to the Uptown Transit Station?
Yeah, maybe I'll start and then Jonette, certainly jump in here. So a lot of effort, a lot of work went into this, and kind of distill it down to a few comments here. We worked very closely with Metro Transit on their bus operations. I think Becca referred to that in her earlier comments. And so we have a very good handle on where the bus, can benefit from an exclusive lane, where it kind of needs the help. And so part one is that we factored in what the bus travel times and experiences are. And then part two is we wanted to have a holistic design for the whole corridor. And when we get down to the south, kind of that last block there, Lake to Lagoon, the counts are not as high as they are at Franklin. At Franklin, we have very high counts, and we needed to kind of expand our roadway a little bit. At Lake, we have kind of a little bit of an unusual situation going between Lake and Lagoon. And what's going on is, although the counts are not terrifically high, we have a very high number of turns on and off the corridor. And if you think of like Lake Street eastbound to vehicles turning on to northbound Hennepin, we have a very high left turn there. There's 2 left turn lanes today that make that move. We're going to keep that into the future. So we kind of needed 2 lanes to accept them. So we didn't really have real estate or space for separate bus lane. Similar, yep, thanks. In the southbound direction, we have a high, I guess it'd be southbound to eastbound left turn onto Lake Street. We kind of needed to establish some space for that. It's a shared lane, but we'll have signal heads and arrows and whatnot to help that. And I'm kind of rambling here, but I just want to give you a sense of what went into these decisions. And then both Lake Street and Lagoon are much higher volumes than like our other cross streets that cross the corridor. So when we look at how we operate the signal and how much of the green time we can give to north-south versus east-west, Lake and Lagoon have a pretty high demand or draw for signal time as well, especially with the new B-line bus rapid transit coming. You want to be able to accommodate that. And when you kind of mix that all together, we end up with, I'll say, a composite design for the best thing holistically for the vehicles that are from Lake to Lagoon and for the buses that are traveling through there, are to expand that roadway to the 4-lane section. So south of the transit center, we won't have the exclusive bus lane, but we feel that by providing the 4 lanes total, and in this case, intermingling the buses with general purpose traffic, we'll still be giving them good service, and we'll be providing good service for the, for the other modes, in this case, for the vehicles on the corridor as well. So just a little bit of, I'll call it a hybrid design for those last block or two there from kind of 29 to the transit station to the south. And we just felt that was the best composite design for the corridor. without taking more space curb to curb by adding like another lane for a bus lane. And then we'd lose the space for the bike lane or widen sidewalks and so forth. So that's how we came up with that.
And I think the second part of the question, if I was to more accurately translate, would be then what about the sort of bike lane transition across Lake Street there that as it heads to the south? That it seems a little funky.
Rachel, I missed that one. So maybe I'll start and then Jeanette, I know you have the picture if you can speak to it. So certainly south of there, we all know that south of there, your road was rebuilt about 3 years ago or so. And we do not have the bike lane at the sidewalk level. We have the bike lane at the street level with the painted bike lane. So in this case, we have two-way bike lanes, one on each side, or one-way bike lanes, one on each side. And we'll transition. So Jeanette, do you just kind of maybe want to use your cursor and walk us through the layout there?
Sure. So the northbound bike lane is on street, and so it will transition into the two-way bikeway. It'll stay on the east side of the street. For southbound bikes, as they're coming along, they do need to cross Hennepin and then transition to the on-street bike lane on the south side of Lake Street. So that's the tie-in point. So this piece, these parts of the turns are behind the curb, but there is some transition to the on-street.
Thank you for clarifying. So Katie, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I just had a kind of follow-up question to this. Given this kind of layout, and I know there's been some rumblings around what's happening south of Lake Street, is there opportunity to do some realignment such that there's not a need for cyclists to cross the street and then to go south? Basically to have two-way bike lanes south of Hennepin, or sorry, south of Lake Street.
Katie, I think it's a great question. I think, yes, as you know, there have been a lot of questions and comments specifically on the activity block from Lake to 31st Street. I think it's fair to say that those conversations are ongoing. I think a lot does depend on the approval of this layout so that we can work on perhaps an enhanced or improved transition in the future. At this point, we haven't spent time focusing our efforts at all on that southerly portion, just because we're really trying to shore up and advance a layout for the segment to the north. But I would imagine if this layout is approved, we will be looking at making some sort of transition on that southerly block. We know that there have been some ongoing operational challenges that Traffic and Parking Services specifically, and Alan's been involved in a couple of those recent conversations that we've been working to address. So it's on our radar, but I think in terms of future, a lot depends upon this layout actually getting approved by the council.
Thank you. So I had said we were only going to go for an hour for questions. We're already well over that. This meeting does generally go until 8. So if everyone's okay, there's a lot more questions that we're not going to get to all of them, but I've picked 2 out that I think are kind of relevant for closing on. Is that all right with you guys, Becca and team? Okay. The first one, Kevin asks, city policy on tree retention replacement to ensure we can maximize benefits of existing new street trees. I know you had kind of mentioned that a little bit in your presentation, Becca, so maybe if you can give us a little bit more info on that.
Yeah, I'll just start by saying that, one of the elements that we thought was really critical as we looked at the redesign of this corridor was trying to ensure that we were able to retain as many of the healthy trees along the corridor as we possibly could. There are some scenarios and situations along the corridor where that just won't be feasible. It's inherent in our design. When we started looking at this really closely on a block by block basis, we've had the park board, review all of the trees in the corridor. We know which ones aren't as healthy as others. And there's certainly been a very concerted effort on behalf of the project team to preserve as many as we can. I don't think that we ever able to fully retain as many trees as we'd like, especially when there's underground utility work and other things that we're looking to do on this corridor, as well as moving curb lines. So I don't have necessarily, a quantity estimate of what we're able to retain at this moment. I know we have some figures, but that's always been an objective for us on this corridor there. But I will say with confidence that there will definitely be some trees removed that we wish that we could save. It's a challenging situation, and there's no question that one of the fundamental principles that we're trying to incorporate, whether it's vis-a-vis the green infrastructure or just having adequate boulevards, is that we were really careful about where can we accommodate certain widths along the corridor so that we can replant trees in the event that those need to be removed on certain blocks. So it is a focus. It is something that we care about. And again, I wish we could preserve all of the healthy trees along the corridor. It's just not feasible with all of the different elements that we're looking to include. So that's going to be something that we continue to work on through final design, as well as those green infrastructure amenities that are above grade, as Jeanette mentioned.
And so quick follow. Is the medians that are planned, the medians will be planted? Will they, or is the intent that the medians will be planted?
It's a great question, Kevin. In our also another dream is in spaces where we have adequate width is to do plantings in the median. What is always the challenge, and I think you probably know this if you've participated in any other reconstruction project that the city as part of engagement, is that one of the biggest challenges that we have is with maintenance on these and having a committed plan for maintenance. Sometimes, as you know, that will defer to special service districts, and there are 2 in this specific location. And other times that's something that is accomplished by having city crews do maintenance. But in our, from our perspective, there are areas, specifically the one that Jeanette kind of panned to here, where we have 6 feet. These are areas where we could accommodate trees and other types of plantings. There are some locations, however, that get down to 1 to 2 feet. Those are going to be more challenging. And so, I definitely don't want to overcommit. It is definitely something that we are interested in doing. And similar to the other conversations that we've been having tonight about the design elements, we're hopeful that we can get to the point where we can do some plantings. Again, just overall concerns with how do we maintain them, who maintains them, and those sorts of responsibilities are always just sort of a hang up when we start looking at these. And with that said, yes, I'm well aware that there are great landscape medians all over the place, and I wish we had more width throughout the corridor to be able to accomplish that. But one thing that we did try to do in this circumstance was really push that greening towards the edge as well. And where it is feasible, we do have those wider elements, especially at those pedestrian crossing areas where we can accommodate trees. So I know that was a mixed answer. We're hopeful, but at this point, it's hard to say with full commitment that we're going to be able to specifically green those, unfortunately. And I don't want them to be concrete or some sort of impervious surface either. So it is certainly something that we will continue to work on and push for.
And I just brought up this block just as an example. So you'll see the median actually gets skinny here. It goes to 2 feet. And we did that where possible so that we could have green on the outside. So what we didn't want was a median that's 3 or 4 feet, which isn't really wide enough for planting, because that's got to account for the curbs. And then also a space on the outside that isn't wide enough for trees. So in some spaces, like Becca said, we did push that space to the outside so that we could have 1 good green space instead of 2 very narrow, not really good for green space.
Well, we here in the Wedge, we're kind of punk rock. So maybe that sounds like an opportunity for innovation. Maybe there's a partnership with the U there to really explore what, tiny urban medians with low maintenance and that can handle salt look like, right? Okay, so last question. First off, I want to just thank everyone. This has been such a wonderful conversation. We've recorded the whole thing. I know that this has been helpful for a lot of people, and hopefully we can continue to share this. And there are a ton of questions that were not answered. We're going to make sure all those questions get to Becca and her team so that they can respond to those comments as well. I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to them here. I guess with that, the last question, which seems relevant, was asked by Nick. It says, what happens what happens if the project isn't approved by city council or the mayor or whatnot? Like, what's the sort of plan B? What's the process on that if we happen to run into a scenario like that?
Another great question. I assume that if it is, clearly a situation in which the city council won't support it, or the mayor doesn't support it, again, just as we transition into this new form of government, and that there will be some direction provided to us. Obviously we hope we don't have to start completely over. I think there's a lot of good work that we've demonstrated within this cross section and the street design overall. But that's unfortunately, we don't have a ton of detail on that, right? It's to be determined. Obviously, we have shared the different options, starting when we had numerous options. And again, as Jonette mentioned, I feel like we've explored every potential design option for this corridor at some point in this process, so that we could be considerate of all of the different feedback that we were hearing and all of the different vantage points and perspectives. We feel that this is the right design to advance to the city council for approval. So as a department, this is our best design for the corridor. With that said, we knew there was never going to be a perfect design for the corridor. And so we'll see what the steps are. Again, if the city council, I'm sure there'll be some sort of directive. That's typically how it works. If they deny a layout approval, if it is not supported by the mayor's office, for example, typically there's direction that's provided that helps us potentially get to some sort of other alignment other than the one that we proposed. So we will see. We're hopeful, and I can't thank you enough for how well this meeting was moderated this evening. We really appreciate it. We appreciate all the feedback, and we certainly understand all the concerns that are being expressed by the business community as well. So I just want to acknowledge that that's not, we're not ignoring that feedback at all, and just want you to know that we're all considerate and conscientious about that.
And it sounds like lots more to come. So as always, thank you so much for continually coming back and answering all of our questions, and making sure that we all feel heard. The door is always open. There's a lot, I'm sure there's going to be more decisions to be made in the process. So you always come back, and you're welcome here. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful night. A reminder, Paul added in the chat, please go take the surveys, our survey, the city survey as well. LHENA, we have in the past and on this particular project, and we will continue to distribute all the feedback that we get from our neighbors to the city. So when you send letters or feedback directly to them, that is also great. But if you send them to LHENA, we will make sure that the city gets them. So, and all the results of this survey will be a part of that. So thank you very much. And as always, let us know if there's anything else. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.